south, maintain.
Welcome back to the Sunshine State Rails from the Florida Railroad Museum. It's late 2022, and by now we're well into the holiday season. The museum's been up to a number of things over the last few months, but we're going to be focusing mainly on the operations from November 13th, a particular Sunday where that weekend the museum was closed to its general admission train rides. Before we get too far into this though, I'll mention that about a month ago on October 10th, the museum had a crane rental firm out here at their Willow Yard to rotate their CF7 number 204 to face southward. An interesting decision, as I'll simply put it, but it was quite a spectacle to watch from the ground, I'll admit as well. The sight of seeing a full-size locomotive just up in the air like a toy is totally mystifying to me. And the way that these guys were able to maneuver these cranes to get the thing turned around is equally impressive. So, should you visit the Florida Railroad Museum and see their CF7 facing southward, now you know why that is. Also, on that October 10th, off to the side, the museum shop crews were hard at work renovating their new Seaboard Coastline caboose. This caboose I briefly mentioned in my 8330 Second Chance video. Welding, adding new material, adding more paint primer, and almost totally replacing the doors was all necessary work to this caboose that hasn't seen mainline service in decades. The car in particular was built in 1952 as part of an 100-car order for the Seaboard Airline Railroad. It would become part of the Seaboard Coastline when the SAL merged with the Atlantic Coastline. At some point after the 1967 merger, the caboose found itself in the Waterfront Park in Kissimmee, Florida. In that park, the caboose would continue to sit as a concession stand, for which it acquired its red paint scheme consisting of the phrases ice cream, cold soda, water, and good food. The city of Kissimmee donated the caboose to the Florida Railroad Museum in 2012, and in 2022, another decade later, this caboose is finally getting into the shop and getting a full makeover. This thing was in very rough condition when it got here, and when they started to renovate it. The floor inside had to almost be completely rebuilt from nothing. Almost all of the outside material had to be replaced, the doors included, but the shop crews were very consistent, and that leads us to November 13th, 2022, where there are still a number of renovations to be done to the caboose, but the first operation of this odd Sunday would be to give this caboose a run down the main. For today's work, they'd be using former Conrad Yelvington Alco S2M number 251. Engineer John Halash prepares the 251 for the round trip to Parrish and back with the caboose in tow. They'd pull 251 out from its current track and reverse onto the track on which the caboose resides. There was still a bit of uncertainty here because, like I said, this caboose hasn't seen any sort of mainline service in decades. So once the 251 was hooked up, they'd have to make sure the air flowed properly. This would simply require performing a brake test. The crews would watch the brake shoes as well as the brake cylinder. Proper airflow into the caboose's airlines will allow for the brakes to set and release on it. And it took a number of tries and a little bit of WD-40, but they got it working well. Well enough that the southward trip would commence. And so, just after 10 a.m., 251 would depart Willow Yard southbound with the newly painted Seaboard Coastline caboose in tow. And I mean newly painted. They had to do one side at a time, but the paint job on the caboose was completed 4 days before the recording of this video. As the crew departs Willow Yard southbound for Parrish, we'd move about 4 miles down the line to Dickey Road for a real run-by. And it's at this point that I'll introduce one of my personal projects for the museum. Unless you're out here all the time, you won't really notice a difference, but I have some before and after shots for you. I've recently started clearing a lot of the vegetation around Dickey Road myself to open up the crossing and get better visibility. The stuff around here is wild, grows fast, and consists of a lot of weeds, brush, and Brazilian pepper trees. And so at the time I'm making this video, I've had one session out here to start clearing brush, and I've gotten a fair amount done. It does also help that the museum has recently sprayed their track to help with killing off some of the excess weeds on the right-of-way. However, this spray doesn't really extend beyond the track into the ditches or trees that are growing just off to the side. So, it's most of that stuff that I've had to take into my own hands. Like I said, at the time of making this video, I'm not done out here and there's quite a bit more to be done before it starts looking good. But as for this northwest corner, this is what it looked like before, and this is what it looks like now. For the northeast corner, this is what it looked like before, this is what it looks like now. And for the southeast corner, this is what it looked like before, and this is what it looks like now. Again, not a whole lot has been able to be done, but I have more sessions planned to get a lot of this stuff cut back before the winter. But before I could admire my work too much, John was right on my heels with 251 cranked up with the caboose in tow. I didn't follow them any further south with the caboose because I didn't know how far into Parish they were going to go, so I simply pulled the car to the other side of the tracks and waited, because they would be on the return trip pretty soon, and in about 15 minutes, so they were.
5, 2, John, bring it into the shop. We'll come up with a game plan on what we're going to do with that caboose, because we just simply don't have a lot of space. Okay, coming in. Stop it right where I picked it up this morning? Yeah, that's fine, and then we can do the job brief of what we got remaining.
With the caboose having gotten its roughly 12-mile round trip completed, they'd bring it back into the Willow shop for inspection as the test was complete, and they'd have to look over it to see if any issues were there. How'd it go, all right?
Yeah. All right. Thanks, cool. Real good. The wine bearing about more than
Now that the caboose is back in the shop, the test they had to run this morning involved bearing observation. The bearings, as in the mechanisms that allow the wheels to turn within their metal frames called bogies, are not the modern type that you find on most American freight railroads nowadays. This caboose's trucks consist of sliding contact bearings, or simply known as plain bearings. This involves the wheel bearing spinning inside the box and rolling across an oiling pad which oils the bearing and allows it to turn over the friction of the metal. This, however, if the oil's low or if the car has sat for decades without moving, can cause the bearings to get extremely hot if there is not enough lubrication inside. Any excessive heat would cause concern because too much heat can melt the metal. And since the caboose had sat for as long as it had, it was almost necessary to run this test. and all the caboose's bearings passed the test except for one on the northeast corner. Opening up the gearbox, a temperature gun would reveal that that bearing was excessively warm. Nothing too dangerous, but something that they definitely want to have caught now than later. With this information, they'd do some more maintenance on that bearing before running another test like this one in about a week. Just afterwards, the crews walked back into their storage yard to inspect a consist of old boxcars and locomotives, as they'd have to move this consist out to retrieve one of those boxcars and one of the locomotives. The stuff back here hardly ever moved, so they had to make sure that any chocks or other debris was out of the way before they moved the consist out. And the rest of the day's work would continue with 251 and the caboose at the head. They'd leave the caboose behind 251 as it would save them from having to put it off to the side, which would be difficult due to the limited space they had, and it wouldn't cause any problems with the issues in the bearing we found this morning, because this is very slow and short distance work that won't cause enough friction to really do any damage.
So got it that time. Stretch it, 251. Good. Stick from south, 251.
The crews all watch the consist very carefully as it slowly rolls off their storage track. This consist consisting of some very rustic equipment, such as their long since passed Alco RS3 number 8604, GP7 switcher high hood number 1822, and X Tri-Rail FP9 number 904. They'd have to pull everything south of the yard so they could sort out two of the pieces, one being their tooling car, this yellow box car consisting of tools and other materials used in various restorations. The other being that FP9 904. They'd move their tooling car out here to the yard so they can use the stuff inside for upcoming restorations, and they'd move the 904 to the front of the line of the rustic equipment so that if people come into the yard on the train, it's a bit of a prettier unit for people to be able to see, as Train Master Josh would put it. This was a pretty simple set of maneuvers, just a bunch of back and forth switching, although very slow because of how old the equipment is. But once they got everything to their liking, it would all be put back right in the same place, and the 8330, which they had to couple onto in the beginning to access the track with all the rustic stuff on it, they'd place just beyond their makeshift road crossing in the middle of the yard for when the cranes come in to lift the hood off when they prepare to put the new prime mover into the body. I don't have any word yet on when this is planned to happen, but plans are obviously still in the works because they have the prime mover right here. Though I'd be willing to bet that once their very busy holiday season is over that they'll be able to invest the proper time into this project. The final maneuver to complete this day's work would be to pull a car out of FPL. Now, what does that mean? That means they'd be heading about a half-mile south of their Willow Yard to the FP&L spur. Florida Power and Light used to receive transformers by rail way back when, and so they still have a spur that leads out to their Willow solar power plant. And so over the museum's years of operation, they've used this giant spur to store old rail cars that they haven't gotten around to restoring yet, or rail cars that they currently run that just aren't operating at the time. Leaving the caboose on the main and pulling 251 into the runaround track, the switch would be thrown and they'd enter the power plant spur. It's not all too often that the museum heads onto this track, so it was quite the treat to see today. And so I'd hop in the cab of 251 with engineer Pat as we entered the FP&L property. car we'd be pulling out of FPNL would be the famous Monte Rosa observation car. This car, along with 2 others and a steam locomotive, the museum received in 2012 from the Church Street Station display in Orlando. The car has been on FPNL pretty much since it got here, and now there are plans to restore it, so they'd have to pull it off the FPNL spur and bring it down to their Willow shop so the work could begin. They'd set it back on the main with the caboose, push the other 2 cars back into FPL before locking up the gate, and then hooking up to their consist that they had pulled out to bring it back into the shop at Willow. With the Monte Rosa now off FPL and in the Willow shop, work will begin on it within the next few months, but this would end the work for today and the crews would debrief. Before we end off here though, I have been in the process of making this video for about a month, so some more has happened between then and now. And so we're gonna end off with my personal project of clearing the brush at Dickey Road. Since before, I've had 2 more for a total of 3 sessions out here at Dickey Road to clear brush and whatnot, and this clip was from November 22nd. One of the museum's general admission weekend trains would cross Dickey Road before I'd start my 2nd session. But take a bit of a mental note about how things look here, as after I shot this video, I'd have my 2nd and 3rd sessions ahead of me. And that brings me to this final video, taken on December 3rd. This day was my 3rd session, and after having worked out here for the entire day, by the time I had gotten everything packed up, the museum's North Pole Express was coming up on us. So since I had my gear with me, I set it up on the road for our train, and so I could film for myself a bit of satisfaction in watching a train cross over the crossing which I had just cleared over the last month. I won't harp too much on the train because I'll be out here again for a dedicated night of filming this train, but with my body aching all over from the day's work, I had to shoot this video just to show to myself what I did and what it looks like to see a train cross over it. Also interesting to note on this train is that there are 4 cabooses in the train this year. That 4th caboose being our newly renovated Seaboard Coastline ice cream caboose. By the time the North Pole Express trains began to run, the caboose was totally complete and could be put on the consist for riders to enjoy on a trip to the North Pole. And with newly rotated and decorated CF7-204 on the end, that would mark the end of the train and my hard day's work. And also, the end of this video. I know this video is a bit different from what I normally do, some museum stuff, some personal stuff, basically most of what I've been doing with my time trackside for latter 2022. But I'm equally grateful that I was able to do this kind of work and document the work the museum has been doing, because it's a very interesting thing to see, and not something you see every day. So perhaps for that reason, I hope that y'all enjoy what I made of this as well. And I'm gonna have some more holiday content coming up fairly soon, so I hope y'all will stick around. Thanks for watching, and from Dickey Road in Parrish, Florida, this is Kotabeaner, and I'll see you next time somewhere on the Sunshine State Rails.